Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ventures, a new show where my guests and I get to explore entrepreneurial stories, problem spaces, market landscapes, and examine together how new ventures, either for-profits, nonprofits, or personal ventures, might be able to be formed and grown to benefit humanity. In today's episode, we're going to be examining stories from the perspective of creatives that are building tangible goods or bringing their art to life in some entrepreneurial fashion or another. My two guests, number one, Charles Adler. He's the co-founder of Kickstarter and is the co-founder currently of Lost Arts. And we dive into his story and how he's iterated, how he goes about bringing and empowering creatives to enable their products and services to be brought to market. My other guest, Wilson Fong, is a general partner with me at Prota Ventures, and we provide a wide range of services for founders and for innovation departments that are bringing new ventures to life. And what we talk about today and the stories of Wilson and Charles are meant to be encouraging and helpful for those of you that are spinning up new ventures or building tangible goods today, especially in light of the pandemic. So if you're watching this episode, you can listen anywhere that you get your podcasts. And if you're listening, you can watch this episode by visiting wclittle.com. And there you can view all the show notes for the things that we referred to today. And you can subscribe to my newsletter or different topics that I write about, from health science to technology to all the various subjects that we cover in this show. So with that, I'm excited about this conversation and sharing it with you. Please enjoy this conversation with Wilson and Charles. All right, welcome, Wilson, Charles. Glad to have you.
Yeah,
nice to be here.
All right, Charles, would you mind telling us about your journey?
Yeah, that's cool. I will. Maybe I'll just share like way early journey, if that's cool. Like what
Sure.
makes an individual up or influences oneself. So I currently live in Chicago, but I grew up in Connecticut, and I guess I say that in the time between growing up in Connecticut and living at this instance in Chicago, I've moved quite a lot. Like there are a lot of kind of nodes in that network of my life, from university to, whatever, like living in New York, living in San Francisco, living abroad. And all of those things have influenced me in different ways. Maybe we pull some of that out, or I can reference some of that as we go along. But maybe the important bits for me was, at an early age, I became oddly, and I don't really understand where this came from, but oddly fascinated with architecture. And at the same time, I was also kind of a product of what I'll say is like the New York suburbs, which, at least at that time, geography was really important, maybe less so now. And the references in my life back then, beyond architecture, was things like punk rock scene that was building and growing and really, really intense in that part of the country. At the same time, hip hop and street art, which at the time we called graffiti, which is a whole nother thing, was all around me and super, super interesting. Skateboarding, fishing, all the outdoor stuff, like all of this like potpourri of things were really interesting to me. And I'll kind of skip forward now. I didn't end up pursuing architecture. I sort of accidentally pursued mechanical engineering, so the development of physical things. And one thread from like high school, maybe even before high school, to university, which dates me a little bit, was computers, the connectivity of computers. So I'm referencing modems, and then later the internet. So when I was in university, the internet became publicly available, and shortly thereafter, I guess, I dropped out of college to go be what was called at the time a webmaster, which I think we use the word generalist now. designer, developer, all that kind of stuff. Um, Kickstarter, which would kind of, I think, thread all of this stuff together, which is sort of my interest in all these creative communities, from electronic dance music, hip hop, to punk rock, and the art scenes, uh, plus leveraging technology to connect all of these people, aka Hayes modems and the internet. So I don't know. I think that's the abbreviated version
Yeah.
of a journey
So
in somewhat
as
of a
a kid,
linear
you
way.
moved around a ton. When did you get to New York? Like how often did you move around when you were younger?
Younger was, well, I guess, I mean, my family moved when I was 6 months old. I was born in London, in the UK. We moved to the United States when I was 6 months old, and then the moves between being born and college were really localized. So just moving around Connecticut, and so I was in a suburb of New York. But living in New York and the more active moving was definitely post college. So
Got it.
like 96 to whatever year we are now, 2020.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. Wilson, welcome. Tell us about
Thank you.
your journey.
When Charles was talking, I've known Charles for a while now. I think we met about five or 6 years ago,
Yep.
and it's always refreshing to hear his story, because every time you get to know somebody, they tell you a different story, and you make the connections, and you connect the nodes in a different way. So I'll kind of, on that note, um, piggyback on Charles's background and his connection between culture and art and music with technology. And I think that is a really, really great place to be. And I think that I come from very much that same vein. My background that's relevant to culture or technology is I lived from the years of, I arrived in Ibiza in Spain in 1990 for the first time. And that scene was really the fusion of the European Union coming together, electronic music, and the openness of ecstasy as a drug that hit the culture, and it permeated through culture throughout Europe and North America. So I was in the midst of that. I've been traveling around the world for since 1995, and in 1990 ended up in Ibiza, but I was also living in England, and I was going to university, later law school. So I was very blessed and fortunate to be able to have a journey over there. And that opened me up to what was going on in terms of the cultural movement, and how electronic music, dance music, became a part of the culture. And I was very immersed in that. I ran the biggest nightclub in Europe for 4 years, and got to see some very amazing, I probably will need to at some point write down all of the different stories, the narratives in my mind. So one day when I do lose my mind, I can still reference them and go, oh, that happened to me? Holy shit. So I think that gave me the opportunity to get in the music business. So I started a record label, and we put out 26 CDs, DJ music compilations. We licensed them. That taught me a lot about how to support independent artists, right? I think that's something that was very important. I think it's permeated. It's a thread that's gone through my journey. It's been licensing tracks from independent artists and music record labels, and then marketing them, because that's the compilation business, right? You basically take something, you repurpose it, and then you give it to you promote it to the users, to the listeners. So that was a really interesting life lesson going through that. And I think then technology hit, disintermediated the music business, and I saw that, and it fascinated me. Like, how do I take this creativity and move it over here and be part of the disruption engine, be part of this newness and this knowledge and this new paradigm. So that, I think, one of the big things I would like to say in terms of connection of culture and technology and my past of how I got here was I got involved with a Chicago company called Threadless that was also using technology and using ways to support independent artists and independent creativity and the mom and pop and this underbelly of what creates the soul of society, right? All of the things that fall into mainstream come from this friction point of despair, right? And challenge and conflict. You get this so that's going on in society, our society at the moment. So like there's something here, and it's great to be talking to Charles and to Will. I've known you for many years now. We've launched a business together, and to see and to share this screen with somebody that's lived their life connecting culture and technology too. So I'll stop there.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm honored to have the both of you here. The title of this show is Ventures, and part of our day job, Wilson, is we talk to founders, lots of different founders all around the world that are curious about how to build new products and services, and often have lots of questions around those first steps of the entrepreneurial journey, including from just you have an idea in your brain, you can't stop thinking about it, to how do you actually go about executing it. And what I love about the both of you is there is a endless stream of stories in your own entrepreneurial journeys. So maybe let's go back. Charles, do you have an early entrepreneurial story, or what's the first story that you remember in your life about doing something adventurous from a business or business-like perspective?
Yeah, it's funny because I often say that I didn't grow up wanting to or ever doing a lemonade stand, right? So like I had no lemonade stand. I'm not that, like that's not part of my past. And so there's no like early, an early reference for me. Maybe I was a late bloomer. I think I am sort of late to the party in some capacity, but there, what I would say is like there's this thread or this connection between like the journey of being an entrepreneur that equates to, in my mind, like the journey of an artist. And it's not to say they're the same, but simply to say that there's some patterns. And so what I would, I guess reference there is like any artist is effectively generally going against the grain, right? They're kind of putting a new idea out there, and if the idea is out there enough or odd enough, the general reaction is like, what is that, right? And I don't get it, or that's not going to fly, or that doesn't make any sense. And so I think the commonality there is most entrepreneurs know most people don't quite comprehend an idea before it's actually out in the public, right? And so I think through the story with Kickstarter, I recognize that. I guess the other thing that I would say is if we can agree that the portion of that entrepreneurial leap, right? Part of it is like the economic and the business drive, right? Like I'm going to create something that has economic value, social value, and then economic value. If we can agree that one portion of that is that social value, like will people find this interesting? I could reference something earlier than Kickstarter and the business that I had started just before that. So right before Kickstarter, I had actually co-founded one business that I jumped out of very quickly, and then prior to that, had started a little studio, the independent studio, right? Design, product development, so forth. And that was 2003. But way before that, and actually kind of a precursor for me, at least, to Kickstarter, was this horribly titled side project that I had been working on while in consulting. So I was in technology consulting from, let's say, 96 to 2003, I think. And that project was called Subsistence, and the focus of it initially was to support other DJs. So I was also a DJ in the 90s, and but wasn't interested in the whole scene, like the whole promoter scene and like getting on the big stage. But I really loved this radio show that I had here in Chicago. And so for me, knowing a number of other DJs that didn't have notoriety, I wanted to give them a place in a new place, which was the internet, that got them reached people outside of, sort of our little hobbitville of Chicago. So I was living in Chicago at the time. Again, another stage of my life. And so, in a way, I think some of the best things we work on are these like side projects that don't initially have an economic drive, right? And are really just trying to figure out a connection to culture. Like, is there a cultural interest in what I'm working on? Is there a cultural need? So I guess, the short answer is 2003 was like my first leap of faith as a business owner in consulting. But back in 96, I had started this little subsistence thing, which ultimately led to my partnership with my co-founders with Kickstarter. If I hadn't done that, I don't think I ever would have understood what Kickstarter was.
So as a teenager and into your college years, did you kind of know that you had this entrepreneurial drive, or what was that like?
Yeah, I guess I'd just say like there was this drive. I mean, to be frank, like in college, I wanted, as much as I said I didn't want to I wasn't very good at promoting myself. Like if I was going to get a gig, I wanted to get a DJing gig on the merits of my DJing skills, right? And generally speaking, you really have to, as we learn now with any industry, network. I didn't like that. Like that wasn't my cup of tea, right? So, yeah. So I guess what I would say is like I was more interested in like being a DJ, and before that was like more interested in being in a punk rock band in high school, and as well as being a well-respected architect. Like I want to be a designer in some capacity, but I never really thought of wanting to start a business per se in that term. So that I would say that language didn't at all come into my vernacular until like the early 2000s.
Got it. How about you, Wilson? Growing up, did you have stories of this entrepreneurial drive?
I don't know if it was stories rather than it being more around me. I grew up in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and in a neighborhood where there was a lot of European immigrants. We were one of the only Asian families there, and what was interesting, which was ironic at the time, because Vancouver is now known to be very dramatically Pacific Asian city. However, back then there were a lot of German and British and Southern South American Jews that came into that neighborhood. So they were all very entrepreneurial and successful. And so there was this kind of already in your face entrepreneurial, aspiration kind of, look at so-and-so's dad, that's got, 8 chains of this store that he created and is now doing very well. So I think that was always in my life. And so I always kind of had that. And I think the challenge has been understanding entrepreneurship is not easy. Maybe for some people, right? Even you can break down all the different persona types. For the ones that get a lot of success early, they struggle with, what do I do now? right? What happens now? Who am I? And then for what I consider myself as a journeyman entrepreneur, um, how do I continue to define the craft for myself so that I get, I use the word I because it's about how do I get better? How do I become more effective through these decades of challenges that I put myself? Because it takes a certain type of character to want to maintain, the insecurity of what comes next if you haven't had a big windfall, right? How do you continue to develop this craft so that it continues to achieve the goals that you want to achieve, whatever it is that's important to you. Ultimately, I think what we're at, the philosophy, I guess, Will, if I can jump in on that one, it's about how do the craft has to be good so that it flourishes other people, right? Goodness comes from the results of the craft, and I think that's the practice that we're doing, and that's what's great to hear about Charles, because he is also, it sounds like, somebody that is in this for the thick and the thin of it, right? You're not jumping around from one sector of the space. We consider ourselves entrepreneurs, right? And we're going to continue this path, by whatever means necessary. Sometimes you have to take a side gig over here to do
100%.
whatever you need to do to make ends meet. But we're living. Entrepreneur is the profession.
Totally. It's funny. I think just riffing on that a little bit more, that like sometimes you need to take a sidetrack or whatever. When I was leaving Kickstarter, and this was 2013, 2014, which, good Lord, that sounds ages ago. I had spent a lot of time kind of preparing for what the other side of that would look like. What do you spend your time on? Once you make the announcement, what's this sort of flurry of interest that comes from something like that journey, right? That label, that brand, whatever. And one of the things that I still think is important that I wrote down was, I guess there's two things. One was, I knew if I look back at all the things that I had done in my life up until that point, when I was 40 years old at the time, and I included things that were professional and things that were non-professional, right? So going back to that subsistence thing, going back to like what are things that I had done in other parts of my life that got me excited, right? Got me interested in. And to me, that was just about creative empowerment, right? Like Kickstarter, again, I'll go back, and Kickstarter was the penultimate version of what was possible. But the other thing that I wrote down, so that was like a pattern that I recognized in myself, right? The consulting thing, I was like, I could do consulting, but I'm not like, that's not a core thing that I was really interested in doing in this next chapter. But I think related to that, the other thing that I thought was important, I still feel is important, that I wrote down, was that it doesn't have to be something that I initiate. Like I can go join someone else's company, right? Whether they, in the last decade were a startup, right, and still have some of that vitality, or I don't know, it was 100-year-old company, right? As long as I think the challenge still felt like it interested me and in some way met that personal criteria of creative empowerment, right? And I still think that, and I'm still thinking about that. But I do think I agree with you, Wilson, on the label entrepreneur, and then maybe once we get off the phone, like I'll probably think about that for the rest of the week. Like, what is that? And maybe it's just that is one thing in a list of things that define me, I guess. But yeah, it's, and I will add, I don't think it's easy. If it's easy for somebody, this entrepreneurial journey, then either they're doing it wrong or we're all doing it wrong. I don't know. It is not easy. And I'm in it again, right? And it's a journey, meaning it's not a short sprint. And it's 10 years after we built Kickstarter, like more than 10 years actually at this point. So it's also just a different, like the map that you created along the way, that I created along the way for Kickstarter, like only part of it is relevant because it's been a decade, right? And I find that actually kind of interesting. It's definitely an intellectual journey as much as it is a kind of physical journey.
So we've hinted at it, but for those unfamiliar, what is the Kickstarter story? How did it come into existence?
Yeah. So I'll give the brief one because it's public and it's like we wrote it on the website on our press page. There's a good historical story that Perry shares, but there's three of us who started the company: Perry Chen, Yancey Strickler, and myself. Basically in that order, right? Like that's how we kind of came together. And the genesis of the story really starts with Perry in New Orleans. So he was living in New Orleans, not really the epicenter of tech. Sorry, New Orleans, but you're not. And so, and similar, I think, in vein at least to what Wilson, you and I are kind of batting around is, Perry was like deeply immersed in creative culture and the creative community. He was an artist, still is an artist, and actually now pursuing art more with more focus right now. But he was trying to put on a party, a rave in New Orleans, and for a number of reasons, mostly economic and some risk concerns, he didn't put the event on. And the thing that led to this idea of what I'll say is like critical mass funding, right, crowdfunding, which is what it would come to be later. But the issue was that he was having to front the whole party, and he didn't have a lot of money. He just had this desire to share a genre of music with the kind of geographic area of New Orleans, right? And the risk was, is anybody going to show up? Like, he's interested in this music. He's got a cohort of friends that are also interested in this music, but that risk of, securing the venue, securing the PA, securing the artist, having to pay for logistics and all that stuff for the artists and bouncers and all that stuff, promotion for the event, and then this question of like, I don't know, like, we would maybe in the entrepreneurial circle say, is there a market there? Like, is there a market in New Orleans for techno? Like, who knows? And anyway, so I sort of pictured it this way. We didn't know each other at the time. He kind of freaked out, didn't do the party, and what he kept asking himself was, is there a way that I could just have people prepay for their ticket, and if there's enough, meaning if there's enough people to just cover the cost, he's happy to do it. He wasn't looking at it as something that he needed to make money on. He just wanted to do this project. And that was in 2001. Mind you, we didn't launch until April 28th of 2009. So you want to talk about journey, it's a long one. It's, I think, generally a good expression of how, some entrepreneurial stories work. They're years, if not decades long, with an idea that's just sort of seated in your mind. Now, mind you, like, he's not a technologist and, wasn't in a tech ecosystem. He eventually moved back to New York, which is where he grew up, and, developed the idea beyond what I just described and started pursuing it. And along the way, as any good entrepreneur, you're talking like Wilson, you're talking about these like little side things you need to do. Well, he was waiting tables at a restaurant to make ends meet. And he had befriended a regular at the restaurant who happened to be I think he was VP of marketing or something like that at eMusic. So this is this guy Yancey who Perry had befriended, and I sort of never actually asked him either of this, but I sort of assume it was probably around basketball or something like that they first started talking, and then eventually talked about music. And Perry had eventually, felt comfortable enough with Yancey to share the idea. So that kind of hints towards that entrepreneurial paranoia that we generally have. And after, a bit of time, Yancey came on. And then it was about a year later that I got introduced to Perry. And the connection there, I think, was a little bit more disciplined than the connection between Perry and Yancey, which was obviously much more social. Perry was looking for some guidance, collaboration to define the product more tightly, right? And really at that point, there was like some early sketches of this idea, and a lot of Google Docs, or at the time it was Writely, just as another time reference, but a lot of docs, a lot of thinking in narrative form. And so Perry met Yancey, I think it was in 2006, and I met Perry at the end of 2006, beginning of 2007, right? So think of that journey for Perry. Mm-hmm. And the last thing I'll say is that, even today, I mean, the ethos of the platform is still the same as I think what drove Perry in 2001, which is super awesome. And then, that kind of use case or that story from Perry was something that the two of us constantly circled back to when we were articulating what that idea would be as a product. From 06 to 2009, April 28th of 09, was all product development. A lot of woes going through that journey for sure. Was not easy, was not linear, and was long. Like 3 years is not, does not go by the Eric Ries book of idea to working prototype in 6 months.
How did you practically? So they pull you in to help with product.
Yeah.
You're whiteboarding for, it sounds like, a few years. The process of actually getting the technology built. How did you do that?
Yeah, so I think this goes to some of the woes piece. So mind you, where Perry had immersed himself in like the tech space for a couple of years, but he wasn't a developer, didn't know how to use Photoshop to express an idea, right, in design. So I kind of filled the gap on the design front. But prior to all that, I mentioned earlier I was in consulting, and when I left school, I was this like webmaster generalist, which means I could code and I could design, and so I had some a deep background with technology, less so at that point in time in writing code, but working with a lot of developers, right, in that 15 years prior. And so, my role was effectively to work through some of those early sketches and work through what how the product would function, but then also work with the development side of the house to build out the product. And I would say, like, what was interesting, and I still think about this is where some of the woes came in. So when I first met those guys and joined those guys, they had a team in Salt Lake City, not New York, where we were based, in Salt Lake City that were developing the product, but they were not moving all that quickly. And some of it, I would argue, was based on the technology. Some of it was based on the relationship. Long story short, we ended up firing them, and then went through a couple of cycles with teams, meaning that we tried out another team and that didn't work so well, tested out an additional team and that didn't work so well. I guess it was a little bit of the, let me think, how many teams did we go through? 3. Thankfully, we didn't follow the Goldilocks story, which is 3 tries of the oatmeal or whatever, and you find the one that was just right. So the third one was not just right, or the 3 strikes you're out kind of story. We went for a 4th strike. I don't know what that means, but and that's the one that got us out in to launch in 2009. So that was, I think maybe the thing to share there is, maybe the reflection is, one is, I suppose that it is not linear, right? And as an entrepreneur, like I could not on my own build what we needed to build for Kickstarter to be feasible. At least the way we were thinking about it. I probably could have invested a couple of months to like reteach myself PHP, and hack together some things to kind of get an MVP of what would become Kickstarter out. But we had chosen, what I would say is like a different path that was, let's build the product that we believe we need to build, and let's build it right. And along with that comes, the I guess in some capacity the path that we took.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of entrepreneurs are just in this constant struggle. Maybe they're business people and they need technology, or they need creative, or a lot of times it's a business person and they think all they need is technology, but they completely ignore the creative and the product. And that third role in an entrepreneur, whether it's the one person wearing many hats or literally three different people, is super critical.
Yeah, I'd say the other thing, just I think playing off of that as well, I think it's, I don't know if this is like because I don't subscribe to any one discipline, right? Meaning I love design, and I'm probably more a designer than anything else, but I love technology. I love some parts of code, right? I don't have patience to do all of the, I would say, deep dive with code, but I've been there. And then perhaps even as an engineer, understanding like the deep value and having an empathy for engineers, right? Engineering, right? And the craft of code, as well as arguably like the craft of marketing and the craft of business. Like all of these things are deeply important, equally important. And I would argue it's to play a little bit on what you're describing, how it all comes together in a collaborative way is at some level the art form, but is also, I think, the critical component in some capacity to success. And so as much as, we were in that position of, entrepreneurs that had some skills, and meaning, if I can put Yancey in the sort of marketing community realm and me in the design and product realm, and we were missing the software development core as entrepreneurs. When we brought in engineers, that was I had to guide that relationship, right? Anyway, I just think that's my point of view is, I think I share your point of view, which is just that these things do need to come together, and it's not, I think what's often becomes troubling, and I think this is about relationships, is I have an idea and I need someone to build it, right? But there's a reality that there's constraints to the execution of that idea, and sometimes that's about technology, sometimes that's about design, whatever. Sometimes that's about society, and if you don't have an empathy or a curiosity for those other pieces of craft that come together to develop what that idea is, I think that just makes your process all that much harder, and has the potential to make the product that comes out the other side better or worse.
Yeah. So we hear this story a ton, where there's an early co-founder team. They are missing the CTO, the head of engineering, the technology. They're dating lots of technology firms or individuals to try to get a product built. Often there's multiple iterations of the code base that that
Totally.
goes through. How are you compensating? How are you and the team compensating the engineers that you're working with? Were you just paying cash, or were you paying them some equity as early co-founders with you, or how did you approach that?
Yep. So maybe just like some context around that, like the question that you're asking, right? Like, and this is maybe related to Prota, which is to say, as a venture studio, like that was not a thing back when we were building Kickstarter. There might have been like one, right? BetaWorks might have been around at the time. I'm not even sure when they started, but and so it very much the norm, I suppose, was one of three routes. Your co-founder can code, and you're building that way, right? That's like that's like the penultimate. You're going to hire a freelancer, right? Which means you need to know somebody that's independent as a software developer. Or you're going to contract a company, a team, right? And for the most part, those are the last one is a cash relationship. The relationship we had with this team in Utah, I think was unique. I could be wrong on that, but was a split. So some equity, some cash. And I think that I say that context is important because I would argue at that point in time, the equity piece was not a smart decision, right? And why I say that was what ended up happening in that scenario was that we were working with these guys because it was one of my co-founders, one of their friends from college was a founder of this agency, right? And so similar to the one of the paths earlier, it's like you're just finding people that you know in your network that can do the thing that you can't do, and you're seeing if they're willing to do it. And so this team and this guy was willing to do it and found what we were working on super interesting. But what happened is they were also kind of a startup. They had just formed. And so as their business, their bread and butter business, which was clients paying them full price for their services, was growing, it seemed like we were getting less and less of their attention, right? Because they're a cash business. And so what we had negotiated with them was a discount on their rate with a mix of cash and a mix of equity. So the equity didn't really equate in their mind as a motivating factor, and it wasn't built into the DNA of the company or the founders. And so that was, really what that led into is like the pace at which they were working was just not effective for us. And the communication was just getting worse over time, and so we bailed from them. So, I guess what I would say is like that relationship could be different now, right? Because there's this whole, and there's many flavors of venture studios that are basically building businesses around that gap in some capacity. And what's interesting is in how I'm building this new venture right now, which is like super, super early, there's another relationship that I've not included in that, which may be a fourth. And this harkens back to something I learned in college when I was building websites for record labels back in the early 90s. And that is bartership, right? So the exchange of time between two people. And essentially what I'm doing now, which I think is pretty creative, resourceful perhaps, is working with a developer who's a good friend of mine, who's awesome, but he's also got his own projects. But he feels like he needs some collaboration, some guidance, some other thought partner around product and design, and arguably maybe even marketing. And so, where I give him some of my time, he gives me some of his time.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, Wilson, I know you've been up close and personal to a ton of ventures over the years. How have you seen the interplay of the different roles work well, and how have you seen that not work so well?
That's a good question. I think the most complex thing about entrepreneurship, like in any business, is the dynamics of people.
Mm, totally.
Right? Anything that is successful throughout history has been successful because the dynamics of the way the people interacted with each other was about that cause, about focusing on creating that success. So I think one of our practices that we've been working on at Prota, and I think that comes from all of the other failed relationships and startups that I've had, is about how do we develop the right empathy and perspective amongst the team, amongst the early team, whether it's a cash relationship, whether it's an equity relationship. How do you develop that communication and that empathy and that perspective that actually practices the things that create the most successful outcomes, where the ego and hubris is left at the door? And I think that, we talk a lot about creating the safety to be vulnerable, right? And creativity is empowered in that space, right? And so I think there's a formula, right? It's not all of the scenarios and all of the situations that we find ourselves in that turn negative is because we didn't apply the foundations of empathy and perspective. And we talk about this a lot in Prota, and across the startup landscape. Strong opinions loosely held, right? Really hard to practice. Easy to say, but really hard to practice, right? Oftentimes, we've had probably a few examples this year where you have two very strong, smart individuals that are strong opinions strongly held. And then you get into a confrontation and then a negative results happen. And so I think all of the things and all of the mistakes that we've made in our past with relationships, we can talk about that all day long. That'll be then that's just gossip, and we don't want to do that. What we want to do is talk about how do we develop in this practice of building companies that can live to fight another day, that can solve a problem for a group of people. How do we basically, within the team, allow for real creativity to happen, real passion to happen, empathy to happen, so that everyone's driving towards the same mission? I think that's interesting, right?
Yeah. So part of the reason why I wanted to have the two of you on in particular is that I spent a lot of time with business, finance, economics people that have ideas for businesses, and a lot of time with technology, software engineers, data scientists that have ideas for business. And they often immediately run to an implementation strategy that often either completely ignores the creative and the branding aspects of things, or plays lip service to them as they grow. And I know that the two of you have this extremely multidisciplinary background, lots of different experiences to go about doing that. But I'm curious to dive in a little bit, and this probably relates to what you're up to now, Charles. I'm curious to dive into that concept of empowerment, both empowerment for humans in general, but particularly for creative individuals that are looking to build new ventures. Maybe share a little bit, Charles, about how you're thinking about that now, and what venture are you up to right now?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think Wilson kind of hinted in that from the the company building standpoint, right? One of the things that I was thinking about with Wilson, what you were saying earlier, is in my mind, a company is very similar to, or one could or maybe should view a company as a community. So it's these people that are kind of going about their day, their business with some focus, meaning that's what the company does, and the community piece is but we all have to kind of live together, right? Sometimes like it or not, sometimes love it. And I think as you were describing that path, or the relationship with through Prota, right? that the two of you guys have, or with other partners or other team members, is you need to leave room for the individual, and you need to leave room for those intense, tense moments, which I think are really good. But it's how do you come out of that the next day, right, and not let those things fester. That I think creates for a longer relationship, and or then there's just this reality that, just like any community or company, sometimes people move away. Sometimes people have kind of expired their time at a place, whether you're a co-founder, or partner, or a individual contributor. So I think that just that concept is kind of interesting. Going back to your question around creative empowerment, meaning like the world at large, I guess. Since leaving Kickstarter, I and kind of giving myself, forcing myself to have this time, prior to walking out the door, the office back in 2013, was I realized at that point that I'm just really interested in the creativity of others and what that creative journey is for them, what their creative process is. And so I went down this, I'm still kind of in this zone, I guess, but went down this process of just talking to a bunch of people as I was traveling around the world or hanging out in Chicago or wherever. And when I say creative people, I mean like entrepreneurs, software developers, designers, fashion designers, artists, like anybody that's making something, right? And trying to make something that someone else will eventually own, right? Whether that's like a single work of art, or whether that's like a product that you're going to make in multiples. And kind of alluding to what, as we talk about journey, like this thing, Lost Arts. So Lost Arts is the current moniker for what I'm working on. The gap that I had seen in all these conversations was an inefficiency in use of space and tools. So a lot of these people had their own studios, or maybe a shared studio, or they didn't have an actual studio. The studio was like the basement or the garage or whatever. But they were basically paying a certain amount for that space, and then paying for the tools in it. And generally the tools in it were either not enough or weren't used all that often. And so it begged this question of like, well, why are you paying for that $1,000, couple $1,000 piece of equipment if you're not using it all that frequently? And why are you paying, a couple hundred or couple $1,000 a month on the space, and you only get to use it? And so that kind of leads into this concept of a makerspace, and really wasn't happy with what was out in the market in terms of makerspaces. And so the first version of Lost Arts was just that, basically, a better version of a makerspace in the worldview of Charles Adler, right? And that was arguably about creative empowerment, which is maybe a couple fold. One was, how do I give more people access to more equipment that they don't already have? So how do I give them a bigger suite of tools in a much bigger space, and at a price point that should be cheaper than the kind of compilation of them owning their own private studio, with the added benefit that you're working amongst a whole bunch of other creative people that can inform what you're working on in some way, right? And so that leads into something that I think is innately interesting about the internet, period, even though this wasn't an internet business at the time, is about community and connecting people. So I was taking a lot of what I would argue is the values that I inherently understood and knew were inherent in the internet, which is about connecting people, and bringing that into a physical space. I'll skip the story of the space itself, but the space taught me something. So I built the space in Chicago. It was a test space to basically, the intent was to inform me how to build a better version so that I could go to market and basically build a bunch of spaces around the country and around the world, right? Like that was the sort of entrepreneurial ambition. And the thing that got me to understand that should be a thing was that I traveled all over the world and spent a lot of time with folks within those categories, and it was clear to me that there was a pattern here that was missing. But the long and short of it is, when running the space, it became a laboratory not for that product, but for a different product. And so what I'm building now, still under the guise of Lost Arts, is basically a software solution that brings creatives together to share resources, basically to give each other feedback on projects, to get them to more quickly get through a roadblock that they've got, right? Whether it's technical or creative, or they just need some outside feedback, right? How do we get them back into that, what I would call momentum, right? Lack of momentum is the thing that kills most projects. And so how do we keep that momentum going quicker is the thing that I'm really interested in. And so that kind of gets into that bartering relationship I have with my friend. And that's what we're sort of experimenting around, is just this idea of, is there a better way for creatives building physical objects to give and get feedback?
So it wasn't until you were just talking there that I realized, not only do we, the global community, have some challenging times ahead, especially until we have some successful antivirals and vaccines for the disease, but it struck me that it has now impacted creative individuals that are trying to build tangible things in a exponentially larger degree than those who can sit and write code on their software platforms, whatever. How are you thinking about, in this season, how are you, it sounds like you've pivoted to get a software solution and helping people collaborate online, but how should a creative person right now trying to build art or trying to build a tangible good, what advice do you have for that person right now in this season?
Oh my gosh. So there's a couple things I want to riff on just as you're talking about this season that I think are really interesting. And Wilson, like, you used this word fortunate, I think, at some point, and I am so psyched that I didn't go out and fundraise to go build a makerspace, because in the span of time from when that was starting to happen, I had actually gone out to go fundraise, and I pulled the plug on it. But in that time, we would not have been stable enough to make it through a month of this pandemic. Like, we would have just shut down 100%, I would argue. So I'm very fortunate that for whatever reason, I saw this other thing and took this other path. The other play onto this is, like, all the infrastructure for, like, supply chain, manufacturing, all that stuff is just in topsy-turvy situation right now for a lot of people. And so, I mean, we see it with, when you go to the grocery store and, like, you can't get toilet paper still, which is hilarious. Or early on, you couldn't get bread flour because everyone, including myself, were like, I don't know, maybe I'll do this sourdough thing because why not, right? And so it is a mess. And so it was, I think what's interesting, perhaps at some level, in terms of this new thing that I'm working on as an opportunity, is, well, how is all that share of information happening? Like, where are the manufacturing facilities that are online or are at capacity? Or, like, how can I switch to a different manufacturer? Or, as a first-time builder of this particular type of product, like, where do I even go in the context of right now? So I think that's really interesting as far as timeliness. On the entrepreneurial side, I also think about how familiar this moment is to when we were building Kickstarter, right? So time teaches us something. And so think about the time when we were building Kickstarter, like 06 through 09, like beginning part of 09, we were going through global economic crisis started by the housing problem, right? The whole mortgage crisis. And that was arguably not a great time, but it actually birthed a lot of really interesting companies: Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, Kickstarter, and a whole slew of other things, right? WeWork, Industrious, all of those things came a little bit later, but all kind of coming out of that period. And so I see this moment as very, very similar, if not, frankly, way more dramatic, right, on many levels. And I had this reflection as I was in January, like freaking out, like, okay, I've got to focus on, I have a focal point on what I want to build. I need to go build it, right? And as pandemic hit, and I was still in this like race mentality, I was like, whoa, maybe I should slow down a little bit, because launching in the midst of this may not be the right time. Just borrowing from, like, simplistically borrowing from the playbook we, kind of fell into with Kickstarter. Maybe I should slow down a little bit and like take my time, because maybe it's another 18 months when might be the right time to actually launch. So I don't know, like that, like, as you're talking about the context of this moment is really interesting. The last thing I'll say, just as far as like people building physical objects, we're in this other kind of context of this other movement happening, which is D2C, direct to consumer, right? Like bypassing the whole retail angle. And as much as like retail for physical goods is still like epically powerful, it's not so much right now, arguably, right? Like retail is in a tough spot because we can't go in. Like I remember going to a Best Buy a couple months ago. This was earlier on in the pandemic. They wouldn't let you in the store. And I was like, well, crap, how do I had to describe to somebody what I wanted, and they had a runner go and find it, right? Thankfully, my articulation was pretty good, and they found the thing. But it was like this new kind of what I would call like interaction model between humans. And now we have this whole like curbside, right? And so then that begs this question of like, well, if that persists post pandemic, right? Like people find value in that. The value is like, shoot, I don't need a huge store, right? I actually don't even need a store that looks nice per se, because nobody's coming in. Like we're just doing this like drive-through thing. It's like Wendy's, but for electronics or something like that. So I think I think the reality of like there's no right answer right now. Like, and I think what's interesting, what gets me super excited, though in a very difficult time, on many, many, many levels. I think what's exciting is there's new patterns that are going to emerge, and there's a ton of experimentation that I'm seeing right now. That's just like super awesome to watch. And the question is like, what shakes out? And I don't think any of us know the answer.
Yeah. So Wilson, you are probably one of the most amazingly relational business professionals I've ever worked with, and human beings. In this season where social distancing, new forms of running businesses, as Charles was alluding to, how are you thinking about both for your own professional life and the way that you're advising the founders that you're working with? How are you thinking about this season and ways to proceed here?
I agree with what Charles is saying in terms of taking it slow. It's very important right now that we are being thoughtful in our actions, and not only in our personal lives, but in our professional lives. And I think there's that when you do slow down and think, okay, what is the right action here? And not only for myself and my family or for this business, but what is the right action for society? And what are the ramifications? I think that companies that are thinking in that way, whether it's a startup or whether it's an enterprise, are the companies that you want to double down on, right? They're thinking not only about the product that they're manufacturing. There are a lot of companies talking about sustainability from a raw goods perspective, right? Those companies are actually, really interesting, right? I read the other day in Microsoft Surface, we all know this, they're doubling down on basically really being 100% sustainable with the Surface, right? Very hard thing to do. But when you have an enterprise dedicating themselves to basically recycling and reusing materials, then that starts to basically shift the paradigm. And I think that as startups, and you're seeing a wave of startups coming up thinking about what is the business model in this culture, in this, in this new that we're venturing into, because there are new business models. Local businesses have suffered. I think we're in the midst of, Prota talks about this a lot. What's interesting to us? What are the emerging technologies? What are the trends that are coming through? But then how do you discern from whether this is a trend or whether it's got staying power, right? That's another thing that we're thinking about a lot. So I think it's watch this space and pay attention, and focus on what you're passionate about. And I think that's another thing that we've been the elusive product market fit and everything that we do, right? And what that means, or user market fit, whatever the trends are going with that. I think one of the things I love about what Charles is saying, is I've been following Charles in his journey of Lost Arts, and the challenges that he's had in Lost Arts in itself is now, what, 5 years?
Yeah. Don't remind me.
No, it's like, we talk about the journey, right?
Totally.
And you're still, right, pre-seed. You're still pre-seed, right?
Yeah, totally.
And so this journey of entrepreneurship with Lost Arts. So, talking to, we're all entrepreneurs here. We're talking to ourselves. It's if you believe in it, never give up. I'm so excited to hear I was thinking, just write a note here, get in touch with Charles and dig into Lost Arts, tires around.
Yeah, totally. No, I want that to happen for sure. Because it's I think what you'll find is, like, it's the same, which maybe goes to your point. Like, there's this problem that I'm circling around, but it's still, like, the product is just different, right? I think we call that a pivot, I guess, but yeah.
Yes, it's throw the word in there.
Yeah.
I think that's an important word to throw into the startup journey, right?
Yeah, totally.
The pivot. People have overused it. I like it. Bring it back. It's important. It's either a pivot or a learning. Anyways,
totally.
Stand on the shoulders of your mistake and move on.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think maybe there's a continuity here. Like, there was no pivot with Kickstarter. Like, we were super fortunate that, like, we came out and the thing worked, right, within reason, and it wasn't perfect, but so I've never, like, this is a new journey for me too, and arguably, like, OG Lost Arts could have worked as a business. It would have scaled much slower and all the things, right? But you were, Wilson, talking earlier about how the things that we're doing now is basically a composition of our learnings, both positive and negative, from prior, right? It kind of goes back to that statement I made earlier, which was, starting a business now, or building a product now, or building a network-based product, which is what I'm building, is, though I've been through some version of that with Kickstarter, the context of now is different. So the technology is different. Even the movements within the technology space, kind of in reaction to Twitter and Facebook and all those public social communities, there's a lot of conversation and activity and launches around, like, private social networks, right? So there are these, like, new trends that are basically cultural, right, or social, and so just that, like, that pivot thing is interesting to me, because in a way, I guess it is what it is, but at the same time, it is just part of that journey. You're constantly asking yourself a question: is this the right product to solve that problem that has that potential that you want, right? And I think it's that somewhere in there, the math of that equation is constantly going through our heads.
Yeah, that's the anxiety.
Right. Yeah, totally. Oh my God.
So for the creatives out there that are building businesses that would have loved to come to a physical space that is Lost Arts and have all the shared equipment and collaboration with other creatives.
Yeah.
People are out trying to do it on their own right now.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about the details around what you're building, and advice for those creative entrepreneurs that are doing their thing?
At the heart of it, I think what Lost Arts was and still is a community of people, right? And a diverse group of within that community. And so it wasn't, I always say it wasn't so much about the tools and it wasn't so much about the space. The tools and the space solved the short-term problem, but the long-term problem I wanted to be able to solve was how do I connect all these people together? And so maybe the advice I would give is, and I think this is common in the like tech entrepreneurship community, so to speak, is, reach out to the people within your network that you trust, right? And because somewhere in that network is an answer or a connection to an answer to a problem that you're having. And one thing that I've realized at some capacity is that that knowledge or that perspective is not distributed very well. Meaning it's still very insular to the big tech entrepreneurial ecosystem, right? The venture-backed ecosystem, and so I think spreading that gospel, if you will, I think is really important. So I guess the advice would be lean on your friends, lean on your network, lean on your collaborators and your team more heavily. Because I think right now that's all that any of us really actually have.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So you mentioned you're building. Oh, go ahead, Wilson.
Oh, was just one thing I'd like to add to that. You're spot on, Charles. I think one of the things I have been thinking about recently is doing more node connecting. Node as a reference, as a metaphor to two really important pieces that you don't know could spark something until you connect them. And I think, and one thing I'd add to that is coming prepared, right? Lean on somebody, but come prepared. Come with your homework done, so you're not just winging it. And I think that's really, really important as well.
Totally.
So Wilson, what are you thinking about now when it comes to the rest of this year and the way that that you're thinking about venture building in this season in the global landscape, but particularly in what's in your life right
now? Prota takes up a significant amount of my time in terms of thought muscle and productivity. So it's about how do we continue to practice our craft of venture building and supporting entrepreneurs in a way that removes or not removes, but puts the compensation piece aside, right? We're here to build trust with the right folks. And how do we do that? And how do we continue? How do we practice and get over all the insecurities quickly? And how do we scale Prota? So it's the product market fit of Prota. What is the product market fit of Prota? And then how do we scale that? So that's what Will and I, we have countless conversations about this. But I think what's been a really good practice is that they're just not conversations. They're what do we thoughtfully think, write it down. Again, docs and docs and docs of stuff. How do we basically then take it and experiment? What are the right experiments? What are the dynamics that work? And then continue to practice that. What are the different models in our world? So that's what consumes my mind and my family. You know what? It's the balance of family, for me, whatever that bucket is, 3 key buckets, right? The bucket is family, self, and productivity and work, right? So those are my buckets.
How about you, Charles? How are you thinking about the future, just thematically or philosophically, moving forward here?
Yeah, I mean, I there's a couple lenses, and I would say that, maybe most of all, I think I'm realizing this through conversations like this, that I tend to be very, my work tends to be very observational. I see something and I become interested in, like, well, why is that happening? Why is somebody behaving in that way? And is there, arguably, is there a product in there? Is there something we can do? And so I say that because there's so much upheaval right now, so much change, right? And that's affecting every person differently. And so, like, as an example, the office I'm in pre-pandemic was basically my office. Now it's an office that I share with my wife. So oftentimes she's on the other side of the camera. And arguably, oftentimes I'm in the shed in the backyard, right? Like, that's my office. And add to that then my 11-year-old daughter, who for the last portion of last year was e-learning, right? And so all of these, like, what I would say is distributed workforce, which is, I've long been in that camp, but my wife has recently moved into that camp because of her job, and e-learning, so learning at a distance, and even, Wilson, you mentioned the surface earlier. I was thinking about touchless interaction. So voice is going to be a really interesting domain because there might be some urgency to it right now. And so the longer it takes for us to come up with at least within the context of, like, one of the issues going on right now, which is coronavirus and pandemic, the longer it takes for us to solve that problem, the more ingrained these new habits are going to be, right? And then over that time, our values could change.
Yeah.
Right. And so what is that as opportunity?
Right.
And that opportunity is the same for, like, people creating new ventures to people maintaining old ventures, right? Like, why do you have an office space when nobody really wants to be around each other because they're paranoid about coronavirus, and or they really just enjoy not commuting all the time,
right?
And they enjoy being around their family for some portion of that time in a way that they didn't before, right? And I think all of that stuff is super interesting, and I think is maybe leads to some change in behavior that is just really good.
Yeah.
For us all. Like, I hate commuting. I do miss my podcasts, but I found that bread making is a great way to listen to those podcasts. So, like, cool.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, this has been a pleasure. I think there's a lot of threads to follow up on here. And Charles, I will look forward to part 2 when the time is right to talk more about your new venture.
Oh yeah, totally.
So final question, where can people find you online? Wilson, Charles, how can people find you?
That's always fun. Twitter. So I'm on Twitter, Cadler, although what's interesting is I was kind of silent for a couple of months, and just kind of resurfaced a little bit, but C Adler. And then if anyone's interested in Lost Arts, you can go to Lost Arts, LOSTARTS.co, where you will find very little other than a form to fill out with your email address to find out when we launch. So those 2 spots.
How about you, Wilson?
Twitter at Wils, WILSFONG, at Wilson Fong.
Awesome. Gentlemen, thank you. This has been fun.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Fun. Thanks, Will.
Take care. All right, a couple quick things before you go. Number 1, I have a general newsletter where I write about health science, emerging technology, software development, startups, and a variety of different topics that we talk about on this show. So you can visit wclittle.com and hit the subscribe button, or you can actually subscribe to specific topics that you care about most. Number 2, I have a portfolio company with my partners and I at Prota Ventures called Startup Rocket. If you visit startuprocket.com, there, if you are spinning up a new venture, you can receive customized coaching for your business model and the vertical that you're tackling. And it's a place for you and your teammates and your advisors and your investors to be all on the same page to make sure that you're not missing anything as you go about the important entrepreneurial work that you're about to get yourself into, or that you have been into for quite some time. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you're watching, you can listen anywhere that you get your podcasts. And if you're listening, you can visit wclittle.com to view the episodes and check out the show notes for following up in more detail for any of the topics that we talk about. And if you wouldn't mind leaving a review anywhere that you watch or listen to this show, that would be super helpful, help get the word out, and helps other people consume and interact with this content. Thank you.